relations of all these countries in the region. ASEAN and China launched the dialogue process in 1991, and China has become full dialogue partners of ASEAN 5 years later. Their relations were upgraded to be a strategic partner after the declarations of ASEAN Concord II was signed in October 2003, leading to the ASEAN community, as you all know. By 2013, ASEAN and China has celebrated their 10th anniversary of the China-ASEAN strategic partnership, which have yielded abundant, tangible achievements and benefits to all people of both sides. As one of the ASEAN fathers, Thailand has been playing a great role in crafting institutional architecture of these institutions. Thailand has brought with it the development of peaceful and friendly relationships with China since 1975. China continues to remind Thailand and Southeast Asia of the fruit of cooperation with China. It could be said that the influence of China are at the very core of the regional cooperation across the three pillars: political and security pillar, economic pillar, and socio-cultural pillar. Especially for this year, it makes a very important step for ASEAN as it claims to achieve the milestone set out toward the realization of ASEAN community. With recent institutional infrastructures, ASEAN faced high expectations of delivering on its regional integration commitments. While the political stability in ASEAN countries, especially Thailand, remains even volatile and remain uncertain, this raises the question concerning the ability of ASEAN as an institution to promote peaceful, resilient, and outward-looking region. Particularly, to what extent the ties between China and ASEAN address the concern over the tensions in the South China Sea, which threaten to poison diplomatic relations between countries in Southeast Asia and China, and the challenge from the recent economic slowdown globally, particularly in China, as well as the non-traditional security issues. On the occasions of this year, China and Thailand celebrate the 40th anniversary of the establishment of their diplomatic ties. This presents a great opportunity to discuss not only how China has shaped and influenced Thailand, but also how it continues to influence the dynamic of ASEAN integrations, in which Thailand has a high stake. Today, public lecture on the topic China and ASEAN, past, present, and future, seeks to address the above concerns over the dynamic of integration, discussing the period before and during the early establishment of ASEAN, the present-day cooperation, as well as the challenge and future prospects of China and ASEAN. On behalf of Associate Professor Dr. Siriporn Washiwaku, the Dean of School of Social Innovation, I'd like to welcome our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Wilaito, Professor of the Political Science Association and former head of Department of Political Science at National University of Singapore. We also welcome a special discussion on views from Thailand by Dr. Chullacheeb, Chinwanno, Associate Professor at Thammasat University, Faculty of Political Science. Allow me to extend a warm welcome to both of our guests to Memphis University and my sincere appreciation for your presence today and to give us a very important lecture that matter to us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajahn Jiroda.
So now we are ready for the guest excellence. So please welcome Professor Dr. Wilaito to give us the lecture. To audience, for any question concerning the lecture, please kindly add it at the end of the lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, for your kind introduction. Professor Chullacheeb, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me thank the School of Social Innovation for inviting me to give this public lecture. I think this is a good time for us to talk about ASEAN. I am from Singapore. This is the 25th anniversary of diplomatic ties between Singapore and China. So in that regard, President Xi Jinping actually went to Singapore for a visit. He saw Prime Minister Lee Luang and quite a number of leaders in Singapore. On top of that, he had a meeting with Ma Ying-jeou from Taiwan. So we were happy to be chosen as the venue for the leaders from both sides of the Taiwan Straits to meet in Singapore, because that's historic. In the history of the People's Republic of China, the two leaders from both sides have not met until this month. More than 60 years, and it was held in Singapore, all right? But of course, in case of Thailand, as mentioned by our chairperson, it is now the 40th anniversary of diplomatic ties between China and ASEAN. If I may add, likewise, the Philippines is having 40th anniversary, all right? Because Thailand and the Philippines established formal ties with China in the same year. So as a whole, it is indeed an opportune time for us to review China's relations with ASEAN. And that is precisely the major purpose of today's lecture, right? That is to review Sino-ASEAN relations. Now, if you look at the map, I don't know if you've got a copy of the map, but you know, China and ASEAN are actually two very important parts of the Asian landmass and maritime network. I think if you are here in Chinwanno, you should know very well that China is physically very close to Thailand. You are close to Yunnan and southwestern part of China, right? But on top of that, there are always maritime routes between the coastal provinces of China and some of the Southeast Asian states like Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, and so forth. So we have actually been interacting for quite a while, right? And historically, if you know a bit about the history of China, the way the emperor looked at the outside world is that he would consider himself as the son of heaven, right? From above. And he's got ruling over the Middle Kingdom. The surrounding regions will be connected to China through what we call the tributary system. The tributary system. Alright? So bear in mind that that is how China looks at the outside world in the old days, right? So if I may, can I look at the next slide? And so true enough, this system, what we call tributary system, dominated China's foreign policy or foreign relations with much of Southeast Asia until the 19th century. Why? Because of the invasion of the West into China. And China has always been saying that they have gone through what they call 100 years of humiliation, starting from the 19th century, and especially after what is called the Opium War. I mean, you are in Chiang Rai, perhaps you can go and visit the Hall of Opium. Then you know what I mean. That with the Opium War, the Qing dynasty was actually on the decline. And as I said, Chinese went through 100 years of humiliation. In the meantime, of course, what about we from Southeast Asia? Many of the Southeast Asian states became Western colonies. The Dutch, the French, the British all came and colonized Southeast Asia. All right, the exception, of course, is Thailand, but most of us became colonies of the West. All right. So bear in mind that there was this difference and gaps with the decline of the Qing dynasty, which is the last dynasty of China. All right. And if you look at some of the Southeast Asian states, you have to bear in mind that when they look at China, they may look at China as a benign power, but at the same time, for some of them, they may think that China is a belligerent power. Why? Because from history, we know that China has invaded some of the Southeast Asian states, particularly the mainland Southeast Asian states like Vietnam. All right? So, if that is the case, next slide please. So there's an image of an aggressive and even malignant northern power, as China, into the culture and even what I call collective memories of some of the Southeast Asian countries, notably in Vietnam and Myanmar. So when we look at China, it's actually a mixed feeling. If you talk to a Vietnamese, they may give you a different interpretation of the way you look at China. All right? So it is a mixed feeling that they may have, all right, when they look at the big power from the north. And of course, when you talk about China's links with us, that is with South Asia, there is also what we call an ethnic dimension. What do you mean by ethnic dimension? By that, I'm talking about the Chinese dimension. The ethnic Chinese actually have a lot of links with China. When there were strong dynasties, like the Tang dynasty, they would not allow the Chinese to leave, whether it's to Southeast Asia or to America and to other places. All right? In fact, those who wanted to leave would be considered as deserters. If you have a chance to visit China, and particularly if you go to Fujian, right, where many of the Chinese in Singapore and elsewhere came from, you notice that they have got a wall along the coast. You know the meaning of this wall in the old days? The wall was built to prevent the Chinese from leaving China by sea. They would not allow the Chinese to leave China. As I said, anybody leaving China will be a deserter. All right? But all the same, for the poor and underprivileged in China, that is, especially those from Guangdong and Fujian, they did migrate to what was called Nanyang. In our case, they call it Nanyang. You know what's the meaning of Nanyang? That's Chinese, but in English, that is the South Seas. They did migrate to the South Seas, especially those from Guangdong and Fujian. And that's why, when you look at the ethnic Chinese in Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Philippines, and so forth, they are mostly from Guangdong and Fujian, which are two southern provinces in China, all right? And so these people migrate to Nanyang because they were poor and they were starving. So what choice do they have? And in the meantime, in Nanyang, that is in South Asia, the colonial governments were looking for cheap labor for development. For example, to work in the mines, to work in the rubber plantations and whatnot. They need cheap labor. What do they get? Not enough. So they try to get it from China. And so these Chinese migrants were welcome in a way because they provided cheap labor for under the colonial government, all right? And that's why, they were able to get a decent living when they reached Singapore, Malaysia, and other places, all right? And so this sort of migration continued until 1949. That is until the communists took over in 1949. That is when the Communist Party established the regime for the People's Republic of China in 1949. That migration stopped. All right. And so most of the Chinese in South Asia actually came from the Chinese who left China for South Asia before 1949. All right. And when they came, they worked hard, of course. They sent the money back home to the hometown somewhere in Fujian and Guangdong. And of course, some of them even, took part in Chinese politics in the local context, in the sense that they supported people like the royalists like Kang Yong-wei. Incidentally, just if you do not know, in the late Qing period, there were a group of officials trying to reform, trying to strengthen China. And of course, to make a long story short, they failed, and they have to run for their life. And this fellow, supporting the emperor, had to leave China for Nanyang, for South Asia, right? So he's one of the royalists. The other one was Sun Yat-sen, who wanted to get rid of the Qing dynasty and establish a republic. All right? And so he came to Southeast Asia too. Why? Because he needed funding, money, to fight against the Qing dynasty. He needed also manpower, volunteers to support his revolution. Eventually, he managed to depose the Qing dynasty in 1911. That was under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen. Last but not least, quite a number of the Chinese in South Asia also got involved in the Chinese Communist movement, in the sense that they became leftist-oriented, and they looked to China as the ideological leader in launching a communist revolution in South Asia. So in that way, the Chinese are still very much connected to the motherland, so to speak. Because at that point, there was no Singaporean identity, no Malaysian identity. So they identify with their home country. The home country is China, was China, right? And so in that way, the links were quite obvious then, right? At least before 1949. But then, after the rise of PRC, that is, after the communists took over, for those of you who have been studying international politics, you know very well that there was the onslaught of the Cold War, all right? And the Cold War divided the Asia-Pacific region into two camps. Which two? The socialist camp and the capitalist camp. The socialists headed by the Soviet Union and the capitalist camp headed by the United States. Anyway, in case of the PRC, it was with the socialist camp, but for a large part of South Asia, it was with the capitalist camp, including Thailand. And so, in that way, what I've stated here is that China and South Asia clearly drifted apart, ideologically or otherwise. And for much of the Cold War, Sino-Southeast Asian relations were strained by what I call the ideological divide in general and the so-called overseas problem and China's support for the communists in particular. So these were actually the problems between China and South Asia. The two sides could not get together. Because of the Cold War and because of this overseas Chinese problem, because of this communist revolution movement in South Asia. And so, now we come to ASEAN. When ASEAN was formed, as you know, in 1967, there was actually mutual hostility. All right? Because from China's perspective, ASEAN was created to work against the communists. ASEAN was working with the West against all communist governments, China, Vietnam, and the Soviet Union. All right? So no way that China could accept ASEAN at that time, that is at the very beginning. But then, of course, things began to change. All right? What are the major changes that we should bear in mind? The most important change you have to bear in mind is no doubt the Sino-American detente. Some would say the Sino-American rapprochement. All right? In the sense that China and the United States came together, especially after President Nixon's visit to China, right? Arranged by Henry Kissinger. So they patch up, and in that way, the United States had a chance to withdraw from Vietnam. Bear in mind that one of the major reasons for the Americans to catch up with the Chinese was because of the war in Vietnam. The Americans were tired of the war in Vietnam, and they were in opposition to American involvement in the Vietnam War. I was a student in the United States, and I saw so many demonstrations against the US government on campus. So much so that eventually the United States decided that we better retreat. In order to retreat, the Americans would like to talk with the Chinese so that it could afford to have what they call an honorable withdrawal from Vietnam. Right? Alright, so that is actually one of the reasons that you should bear in mind when you talk about Sino-American detente. Why did the two come together, right? And so, but to make a long story short, in the case of South Asia, when the two patch up, I'm quite sure that many of the Southeast Asian governments would have asked themselves, how would that affect me? Right? Do I have to adjust my foreign policy? Now that China is working with Americans, the thinking of at least some of the Southeast Asian countries was that we better move closer to China and establish formal ties with China, so that at least there's a channel for us to talk about. That is the formal channel, right? So it was under these circumstances that some of the ASEAN countries established formal ties with China. On the screen, I mentioned Malaysia in 1974, Thailand and the Philippines in 1975. That's why we now have 40 years of formal ties. It all started in 1975. Alright? So, and when China and Vietnam were at loggerheads, that is, they fought against each other after the unification of Vietnam, next slide please, then Vietnam, of course, invaded Cambodia. And because of this invasion, China began to look upon ASEAN as a possible partner in restraining Vietnam's ambitions in China. Likewise, I would suggest that frontline states like Thailand also thought that it would be wiser to have some communications with the Chinese in order to restrain the Vietnamese ambitions in Indochina. All right? And those are the conditions under which the ASEAN thought that they would have to work with China for the security of ASEAN, right? And of course, that is not all. In the case of China, things began to change rapidly too. Why? That was because of the opening up of China. That was because of the 4 modernizations launched by China under Deng Xiaoping, and that is after the death of Mao Zedong. Okay? So when it opens up, we can see that it is more interested to promote economic ties. It's more interested to learn from Singapore, from Taiwan, from South Korea, from Hong Kong, went to Singapore for a visit in 1978. I still remember that. And it was in Singapore that our then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew told Deng Xiaoping, you want to be friendly towards Southeast Asia, why don't you cut off your support to the communists in Southeast Asia? So Deng Xiaoping listened carefully, and eventually we learned that indeed China has cut off its support to the local communists because China would like to work with Singapore, work with Malaysia, work with Thailand, and so forth for its own economic modernizations. Why should it be bothered by the local communists, whether it's in Thailand, in Malaysia, and so forth? And so, indeed, it cut off the ties to the local communists in Southeast Asia. And so, if that is the case, then I would suggest that you began to witness close economic cooperation between China and ASEAN. All right? Even after the Tiananmen incident of 1989, the Southeast Asian states continue to work with China, unlike many of the countries in the West. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with the Tiananmen incident. That was the time when many students and workers demonstrated against the Chinese government. Right in Tiananmen Square, for those of you who have visited China, I'm sure you've been to Beijing and visited the big square, all right, called Tiananmen Square, all right? And it was there then that the students were fired by the Chinese military, and a lot of people got killed. And because of that incident, many of the Western countries began to boycott China in trade and investment. But in the case of ASEAN, in the case of some Southeast Asian countries, they were not that much bothered by the incident, right? As I put it here, they were not bothered so much, and they continued to trade and to invest in China. And so in that way, I would suggest that China had added incentive to be friendly towards neighboring Southeast Asian countries, because the Western countries were boycotting China. So what do? You look at surrounding areas, oh, Southeast Asia, very friendly, right? So we continue with that. And to add to that, I would say that, ASEAN by that time began to be really very active in regional affairs. ASEAN has been active in organizing what we call multilateral meetings. The ASEAN Regional Forum, Post-Ministerial Conference, and so on and so forth, right? So the point you should note is that China would like to plug into this ASEAN circuit so that it can play a part in the multilateral meetings hosted by ASEAN, so that it will be interacting with more and more countries because of the meetings organized by ASEAN. Alright? So in many ways, ASEAN was and is an active diplomatic community. Alright? So it is wiser to plug into that circuit, so to speak. That is from the Chinese perspective. Alright? So let's now talk about the breakthrough in Sino-ASEAN relations. How did China break into the ASEAN circuit, so to speak? Right? As I mentioned earlier, formal ties were established between China, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines way back in the 1970s. Right? But then I must add by saying that as a whole, relations between China and ASEAN were not particularly cordial. Why? I'll explain here. The crux of the matter was that China's relations with Indonesia were still a problem. And Indonesia is what we call the big brother of ASEAN. It is the biggest country. Alright? Bigger than Thailand too. Right? And so, why did Indonesia, not resume diplomatic ties with China? Why were there reservations in Indonesia in having formal ties with China, or resuming formal ties with China? So I'll try to explain here. The reason is there was the attempted coup by the Indonesian Communist Party way back in 1965. Alright? Many Indonesian generals and soldiers were killed because of the coup. If I were somebody from the Indonesian military, I would always have reservations about China. Because many of my colleagues, many of my former bosses were killed in this coup. Organized by the Indonesian Communist Party, allegedly supported by China. That's the problem. There were talks in having what is called a Jakarta-Beijing axis, at least under President Sukarno. And then, of course, Suharto took over after the coup. Right? The point you should note is that the Indonesians could not forgive China because of its involvement, or allegedly its involvement, with the coup of 1965. And diplomatic ties were actually suspended in 1967. And the perception in Indonesia was China is a major security threat towards Indonesia. Alright? And so in that way, no way Indonesia would like to have any interactions with China. Alright? Because of its concern with its own security. Alright? And it's like this. But then, of course, international relations began to change, right? And this can be a topic for another lecture, but let me just recap and highlight the more important things related to China. In the case of China, of course, I've already talked about the Sino-American tectonics, and in 1979, China and the United States established formal ties. The Americans just ditched Taiwan. Taiwan will no longer be recognized as the representative of China. Now they recognize Beijing as the representative of China, starting from 1979. Alright? And with the rise of Deng Xiaoping, as I said earlier, China began to open up. China began to interact with the outside world. And of course, there was the rise of China. Whether you like it or not, you have to talk to China because of the rise, because of its power, because of its economic resources. Right? So, under these circumstances, the Indonesian Foreign Ministry, I met a number of them, would tell President Suharto that it's totally unrealistic for us to ignore China. We have to talk to China. Alright? And then the Indonesian Chinese Chamber of Commerce, I was invited to give a talk over there, and I can see that they were very eager to break into the China market. Because everybody was talking about China at that point, and there were opportunities in China. So you don't go outwards. You don't go, Singaporeans, Malaysians, and Thai to go in. And so you miss, a big opportunity to have, economic interactions and also economic upgrading by interacting with China. And so, as I said, the thinking was Indonesia should bank on Chinese foreign organizations. It is also unrealistic to ignore China in regional affairs. Alright? Especially when you look at the Cambodian issue and also the South China Sea conflicts. China is critical if ever you want to solve the problem. Alright? And so it was under such circumstances that Indonesia resumed diplomatic ties with China in August 1990. Right? And with that, we followed suit. And Brunei likewise did the same in the 1990s. Well, since I'm from Singapore, let me just say a few words about our ties with China. For Singapore, our ties with China are mainly economic in nature, trade, investment, and so on and so forth. In fact, I've written a paper on that. I say it's economics in command. All right? And that is the most critical part. And Singapore is very practical. All right? And by the time when it interacted with China, there was less concern about the loyalty of its own ethnic Chinese. Bear in mind that in the old days, especially for the older generation, they don't think Singapore was their country. They think the motherland was China. So it is a problem if you want to build Singapore up as an independent nation, right? Fortunately, given more time, the younger generation began to identify with Singapore as their own country, right? And in that way, as I said, there was less concern about the loyalty of the ethnic Chinese, right? And then Singapore used to be dubbed as the so-called third China, because there are so many Chinese in Singapore. They think, oh, Singapore is another China, all right? It's the third China. First is, of course, China. Second China is Taiwan. Third China is Singapore. All right? And so we have to tell our ASEAN friends, including the Thais here, that no, we are very different. We are Chinese, but we are Singaporean Chinese. We identify with Singapore as our country. So in that way, to some extent, we were quite successful in dispelling what is called the third China image, right? Last but not least is the communists. The reason why we merged with Malaysia was because of the threat from the communists. But with the agreement of Deng Xiaoping to cut his support to the communists, we can see that communism is no longer appealing to the people in Singapore. Alright? In the old days, no. We have Chinese supporting China, identifying with China. But if you talk to the younger generation in Singapore, I don't think they really look to China, alright? Chances are they will look at the United States, they will look at Britain, they look at Australia, alright? Or rather China, alright? Okay, anyhow, because of all these changes, Singapore, of course, felt more comfortable in having diplomatic ties with China, all right? And when we have formal ties with China, and that was in 1990, late 1990, it was a very simple affair. We don't want to make a big fuss out of it. So if you look at our joint statement with China, when we established formal ties, there were only 1 or 2 sentences in the communique. I can't remember the exact wording, but that 1 or 2 sentences just said, we'll establish formal ties and exchange ambassadors. Full stop, that's it. That's how we established formal ties with China. We did not talk about Taiwan issues, how to resolve them, whether it's one China, one Taiwan. No, we did not say anything like that. We simply said that we'll have formal ties and exchange ambassadors. Full stop, that's all. Alright? But before that short statement was signed, there were a lot of discussions behind the scenes, of course, alright? Because we do have some problems in working with China. What are these? One, our leaders could no longer visit Taiwan, including Lee Kuan Yew. Because in the old days, Lee Kuan Yew used to visit Taiwan very often. Chiang Kai-shek is his good friend, alright? And sometimes once in a while when Lee Kuan Yew is sick, he'll go to Taiwan to see a doctor, alright? Because the medical care in Taiwan is actually quite good, alright? And so there were a lot of discussions on that, and we insisted that we should be allowed to go, just the same. And so the agreement was, okay, if you insist, only low-profile visits to Taiwan. Don't try to make it, like a big event. when you go behind the scene and take a low profile. All right? That was the agreement. Right? The second one, of course, it is important for China, that we have to change the name of Taiwan's presence in Singapore from ROC, Republic of China, to Taipei Trade Representative Office. In other words, you cannot use Taiwan's official title ROC, Republic of China. Because once you use this term, it means that you have a two-China policy, which is not acceptable to China. China insists in having a one China, and that is the PRC, not the ROC. Alright? And so, if you want to join the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and you are dealing with China, make sure you bear this in mind. Otherwise, you create a lot of problems for your own government. Right? China will kick up a big fuss because you Thai official are using this official name of Taiwan, and you got yourself into trouble too, right? So that way, bear this in mind, this term cannot be used in all official correspondence with the PRC, that is the government of Beijing, alright? And so, last but not least, we have to discuss with the Chinese that we'll continue to have our Starlight project. I don't know if you are aware of that. Singapore has been sending its military, our army boys, to Taiwan for training. Because we don't have the space, to train our army. Singapore is so small. Our Air Force, once it takes off, will fly into Malaysia and Indonesia. So how can we train our military? So we look around, and Taiwan was willing to provide the manpower and the resources and the space for us to train our army. And that's why under this project called Starlight Project, we have been sending our soldiers to Taiwan for training. Do you think it's a problem if you want to have ties with the other side? That is China. So China raised the issue, and eventually we said, okay, our soldiers are trained to fight, not against China, but because of our concern of security threats from nearby areas. So we seek the understanding of the Chinese that we need space in Taiwan to train our army boys. We also impress on the Chinese that we send them to Taiwan and other places for training too, not just Taiwan. So Taiwan is just one of the places where we train our soldiers. So eventually, the Chinese said, okay, we will not really object too much. They did not really endorse it. They said, just no objection. Alright? You can do whatever you want, right? As long as you bear in mind that your soldiers are meant for maintaining the security of Singapore, and it's not meant to fight against China. Okay? So that was the understanding, right? So after Singapore, then Brunei followed. And with that, let me just move on to the next slide, right? How to break into the ASEAN circuit. Of course, when we look at China, its big size, its proximity, geographically, its ethnic outreach, lack of transparency in defense, will always create real and imagined problems, alright? I mean, big place, right? And so, it is a problem. But if it is a problem, then the thinking was that we have to engage China. We have to talk to China. And ASEAN has been adopting what we call step-by-step approach in engaging China. Alright? To make a long story short, because of the limitation of time, let me just mention that eventually, of course, the step-by-step approach led to the invitation of China to join the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is the major security meeting for all the countries in the Asia-Pacific region, hosted by ASEAN. Right? Next, please. And China evidently was happy. Next slide. Was happy to join the ARF and some other meetings. All right. At first, it was not so active. All right. But then later on, began to use the multilateral meetings. Once they learned that these meetings are not to be fighting against China, that they can use all these meetings to dilute the influence of the Americans. The Chinese began to be very active. Alright? And then they will support us in what is called a driver's seat in organizing all these multilateral meetings. Alright? Next slide, please. And so in economic terms, the Chinese try to be helpful. For example, the most important indicator that China has been helpful is the launching of this ASEAN-China free trade area after. And this agreement has already been implemented starting from 2010. And because of this, it greatly facilitated the trade between China and ASEAN, including Thailand, right? In fact, Singapore is now the top foreign investor in China for the last 2 years. Right? And so China likewise is also investing in ASEAN. Next slide. And I would suggest that when they launch the Maritime Silk Road, there will be more investments from China. Right? So with that, let me just move on to some of the problems that you may have when you're trying to cooperate with China. No doubt, in terms of trade, economic years, it's very, very close. But there are actual competition. There are also even conflicts. Let me just briefly go through some of these problems that we may encounter when we look at China. What are these? One, of course, is the competition for investment, competition for foreign markets, because some of the ASEAN countries are in a similar stage of development as China. Our products are the same. We are also trying to attract the same foreign direct investment. And so do we think that there's competition? Because some of these, they won't come here. They go to China. Right? They won't come to Thailand. They won't come to Singapore. And so in that way, there is some sort of competition for what we call FDIs, foreign markets. When you want to export, we are aiming at more or less the same market, the US, Europe, and so on and so forth. Again, there is competition between China and ASEAN. But I think the most serious conflict that we have with China is no doubt the South China Sea territorial disputes. I've actually spent one full lecture on that for another class. All right? Let me just summarize the problems that we have with China in the case of the South China Sea. All right? The South China Sea involves quite a number of parties, and the most serious conflict is, of course, the Spratlys, which is the largest South China Sea group. All right? And of course, there are so many parties involved in that conflict, including some of the ASEAN states. And from China's perspective, next slide please, they claim to have indisputable sovereignty over all the islands in South China Sea. Right? If you look at the Chinese claim, their maps will show that they have 9 dashes and circling all the islands in South China Sea. Alright? So in that way, it is going to be a problem because some of us, namely Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines, Vietnam, and so on and so forth, are also claiming at least parts of the Spratlys, but in case of Vietnam, the whole of the South China Sea, right? And all of us involved in the conflict, except Brunei, have already stationed troops in the area. So I would suggest that there could be conflicts, military conflicts, by design or by accident. Alright? And so the situation there, as I've said in the other lecture, it could be a time bomb. The bomb will not explode right away, but if you don't manage it properly, it will explode. Alright? So before it's too late, we have to do something, trying to see if we can work something out with the Chinese. Next slide, please. And in the case of Chinese, okay, it's a problem, we recognize that, but we'll talk to you only bilaterally, one-to-one. Alright? No internationalization of the issue. The Chinese will not go to any multilateral forums, they will not go to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, they will not put the case before the UN, but it just wants to talk to you bilaterally. Because that is to their advantage. China is big. You ask Brunei to talk to China, Brunei will feel threatened, intimidated, because it talks to a big country. Right? So anyway, that's the Chinese approach. But then for some of us, we prefer to use the UN law of the sea to resolve the conflicts. And in the case of the Philippines, we would like to present the case to the Permanent Court of Arbitration to see whether they have a case in claiming parts of the spread lease. Alright? But of course, bear in mind for this issue, it's not just for China and some of the ASEAN states. The Americans, the Indians, the Japanese, and possibly the Australians, and other users of the sea lanes are also interested and concerned about the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. And so they would also play a role. And some of them would also be interested in having joint developments of the South China Sea, because after all, there is oil, there's supposed to be gas in the South China Sea, right? So this is actually one of the most important conflicts that we have with the Chinese, all right? So that's perhaps we move on to other issues, which is basically water-based resources. They can harm the relationship between China and ASEAN. Now, of course, the South China Sea is one major water resources that we may have a problem with China, but since you're from Chinwanno, you should know very well that the Mekong River, the Mekong Basin, could be a source of conflict between China and some of the countries in ASEAN. Next slide. The reason is that China is building dams in the upper reaches of the Mekong River. Right? And the building of these dams, as you know, will affect the farming and fishing communities. It will also affect the local communities on downstream Southeast Asian states, right? Including Thailand, and especially Cambodia and other places, and Vietnam too. And so, but China is insisting that it is one way they can develop what's called hydropower, or hydroelectricity. It's cleaner and greener, and it's a very important source of energy for them. So they'll press on to build the dams. And I would say that, that could be a problem between China and some of the countries in Southeast Asia, right? That are affected by the building of these dams, right? All right, next please. And so the final problem, if I may just add a little bit, is actually the Sino-ASEAN border, all right? And the disputes at the border. Why? Basically, they are related to China's links and support for border minority groups. For those of you from Myanmar, I'm sure you know very well that these minority groups, Luang, Kachin, and so on and so forth, could be linked to China and could be getting support from China in dealing with the central government, right? So in that way, I would suggest that, if you examine a bit deeper, then you know that, it could be a source of problem between China and at least some of ASEAN states, especially Myanmar, for example, right? But I must add by saying that China has already resolved the land boundary between Vietnam and China. Right, that's done. You might add a little bit. It has also resolved the boundary in the Gulf of Tonkin. Right, the Gulf of Tonkin between China and Vietnam. The residual conflicts, of course, are always the parasites and the disparities. Right? So, with that, let me conclude. I hope I'm still at about 5 minutes or so, or 3 minutes or so. Let me make a few concluding remarks. Right? Can I go back? Yeah. Now, in spite of the problems and conflicts, I think China and ASEAN have agreed that such differences should not hamper the overall cordial relationship between the two sides. All right? By and large, I would suggest that our leaders in ASEAN, the leaders in China, are intelligent enough to see the bigger picture. All right? I mean, if you just talk about South China Sea, whoa, it's very serious, very problematic. But there are other things that you can work on, right? There are other areas that we can work together with China. That's why I thought, and in the case of Thailand, it's been actually doing the right thing. Yeah, we know that the South China Sea is a problem, but can we just put it aside and then work on other areas that we can work together? Trade, investment, obviously, the areas that we can work together. All right. So Singaporeans, yes, we're concerned about the South China Sea because we depend on shipping. If there are problems in South China Sea, our economy will be affected. But we are actually in a position to say that, okay, it's a problem, but I'll work with China and invest there. So much so that Singapore is a top investor in China. So South China Sea is not a problem in that way, right? So in that way, of course, you must not blow the issue, the problems out of proportion. Because if that is the case, it would harm the overall cordial Sino-ASEAN relations. The South China Sea, yes, it is a problem, but I've suggested here, why don't we just spend some time talking about joint development and putting aside the issue of sovereignty disputes. All right? So it is actually going to be mutually beneficial, right? If there is joint development. Of course, I must add by saying that I'll be proposing some projects too for them to develop jointly. But all these proposals have not been able to take off. Why? Because once you have picked a place for joint development, there's bound to be one or two countries saying that that area belongs to me. You cannot have joint development. Because every single inch of the South China Sea is claimed by somebody. So, can you start joint development? So, it's easier said than done, although that is the overall direction that we should take. Alright? And finally, I would say that so far, when we talk about problems, when we interact with the Chinese, it's always at the official level, alright? Mainly restricted to diplomats and trade officials. But then I have noticed, look at the last slide, that actually the problems could involve a wide range of ministries. Notably, some of these could be related to defense, security. So you have to involve the military, the soldiers, the officials from the Ministry of Defense. Other than that, yes, discussions are always at the top, at the very elitist level. But then bear in mind that some of these problems could be related to the local government. For example, the problem with the Mekong River, or Mekong Basin. It could be related to the local government. The South China Sea conflict could be related to the local government. For example, in the case of China, it could be related to Hainan. Hainan is the province governing the South China Sea. So it cannot be just Beijing. Beijing will have to liaise with Hainan. And that's why you have to involve the local officials. Last but not least, I would say that it's wiser to engage our interactions on what is called people's level, at our level, that is people's level. You go to China as a tourist, you interact with the Chinese are coming here, and they see Thailand, they see Singapore, and they see Malaysia. Hopefully, with all these dialogues and interactions, then we can promote what we call transparency and understanding, making China and ASEAN to be more responsive to each other's needs, concerns, and aspirations. All right? With that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Lilaito. And now, please welcome Associate Professor Dr. Chullacheeb Chinwanno for our special discussion section. Please.
Good afternoon, Professor Lilaito, my fellow friends, colleagues, and students. I'm very pleased to be here in beautiful and cool Chiang Rai to participate in the Social Innovation Public Lecture on ASEAN-China relations. First, before my comment, I would like to thank Ajahn Siripon, the acting dean of the School of Social Innovation, for inviting me to this event. Second, I enjoyed the presentation on the overview, the very comprehensive overview of the China-ASEAN relation by Dr. Lilaito, a prominent scholar from Singapore, a good friend of mine for a long time. We know each other for more than 20 years, I think. I met each other intermittently at various conferences and seminars in many countries, today in Chiang Rai. After listening to your eloquent lectures, there's no need for me to comment because you cover the ground from ancient time up to the present. But Ajahn Siripon, if she's here, you may not be very happy if I just say I agree with Dr. Lilaito and let's end our public lectures. And therefore, I will make a short comment for about 20 minutes or less, and then maybe having 10 minutes for discussion. I have to apologize for not being able to stay here longer because I have to catch the plane at 4 o'clock. I have classes tomorrow. Anyway, in my opinion, the China-ASEAN relation has been quite dynamic as well as complex, especially in the second decade of the 21st century. For China, ASEAN as a regional grouping is the focal point of Chinese diplomacy in the periphery, especially in Southeast Asia. China's development and rise to be a great power is to a certain extent depend upon a stable and economically vibrant Southeast Asia. It is China's bilateral relationship with some individual ASEAN members that experience a problem because of territorial dispute. As for ASEAN, the strategic importance of China is quite obvious, especially because of the geographical proximity, its economic influence, and also its military capabilities. To many observers, ASEAN-China relations in recent years seem to be dominated by one of the problems that Dr. Lilaito has mentioned, the South China Sea dispute. And this issue concerning the overlapping maritime boundary territorial claimed by China and 4 ASEAN members, Brunei, Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam, on part of South China Sea have led to some tension and often seen as the potential flashpoint in the region. But in fact, ASEAN-China relation is not only that particular issue. In fact, it's much broader and it incorporates many other activities. In my opinion, ASEAN-China cooperation is very broad, cover more than 10 priorities areas. For example, agriculture, infrastructure, communication, human resource development, investment, energy, transportation, public health, tourism, and environment. So I think when we look at China-ASEAN relationship, we have to keep the big pictures in your mind. ASEAN-China relations began their dialogue only 25 years ago, but as Dr. Lee mentioned, that relationship between China and Southeast Asia has a long historical experiences from the Yuan dynasty up until the Qing dynasty, and also a lot of the overseas people migrating to Southeast Asia, and that was the cause of economic. I'm not going to touch upon it because it has been quite well presented by Dr. Lee. But what I'm going to say is that after ASEAN-China started their dialogue in 1991, in that year, Malaysian government invited the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China to attend the opening session of the 21st ASEAN Ministerial Meeting. Because a few years earlier, all ASEAN members have diplomatic relationship with China. Dr. Lee has mentioned that Malaysia was the first in 1974, later on Philippines and Thailand in 1975. That's why we are celebrating 40-year anniversary of Chinese-Thai relations this year. And then by 1990s, after close cooperation between China and ASEAN about the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia and trying to pressure Vietnam out of Cambodia, relationship seem to be much closer and more trust, and then many ASEAN countries felt that China are sincere neighbor which they can trust. And that's why in 1991, Indonesia decided to have diplomatic relationship. In fact, I would like to say that Thailand has played quite an important role. I had the chance to talk to Air Chief Marshal Singh, foreign minister, and he told me that the Chinese foreign minister has asked him to convey the message to the Indonesian foreign minister that China wants very much to have a close relationship with all the rest of ASEAN, including Indonesia. And Air Chief Marshal Singh introduced the Ujusian, the Chinese foreign minister, to the Indonesian. So Thailand played quite a role as a bridge in trying to make ASEAN-China relationship much closer. So by 1991, after Indonesia, we have Brunei and Singapore as Dr. Lee and that's why ASEAN and China start their dialogue as a group in 1991. 5 years later on, China and ASEAN developed into a full dialogue partners. After formally attaining the full dialogue partner status in 1996, ASEAN-China relations also developed quickly. And in 2003, both sides agreed to sign the joint declaration on strategic partnership with plan of action. Now we are at the 2016 to 2020 plan of action. Moreover, China is the first dialogue partner to accede to the Treaty of Amity or Cooperation Act in 2003. China is also the first country who expressed interest in the first nuclear weapons state which expressed an intention to accede to the Protocol of Shortwave, Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapons Zone. ASEAN and China have also collaborated to address transnational non-traditional security threats such as drug, human trafficking, piracy, and terrorism. So you can see that there are a range of activities with China and ASEAN have closely cooperated with each other. Trade and economic ties between ASEAN and China have been growing rapidly. China has been ASEAN's largest trading partner since 2009. Before that, we had Japan, United States, but from 2009 onward, China became the largest trading partner of ASEAN, while ASEAN is now China's third largest trading partner. Bilateral trade stood at about 320 billion in 2012, and it is targeted that by 2020, 5 years from now, the bilateral trade between China and ASEAN should reach maybe $1 trillion US. In November 2012, Dr. Lee Dai has also mentioned that China and ASEAN signed ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement, which also helped to expand the trade between China and ASEAN. Moreover, the China-ASEAN Expo had been organized and hosted by China on an annual basis in Nanjing since 2004. That also helped to promote further trade between China and ASEAN. Moreover, ASEAN is now China's fourth largest destination for China outward investment, and ASEAN is China's third largest source of foreign direct investment. Two-way investment is targeted to reach 150 billion by 2020. As for Thailand, China is now the largest trading partner, number one largest trading partner of Thailand, replacing Japan and the United States. Moreover, from the BOI, Board of Investment, next year China is probably will be the largest investor in Thailand, replacing Japan. Moreover, China has also become a major source of tourism for ASEAN, including Thailand. In 2012, about almost 9 million Chinese tourists visit ASEAN countries, a growth of about 20% over 2011. As for Thailand, if you look into the statistic by the tourist ministry, you will find that in 2014, about 4 million Chinese. And we expect that this year, 2015, maybe 5 million. Maybe we can calculate by looking at the numbers of the year. 2014, 4 million. 2015, 5 million. Maybe 2016, it may be 6 million. That may be one indicator about how close Thailand and China has been. But this phenomenon is not only Thailand oriented, been affected all the other ASEAN countries. In socio-cultural field, cooperation between ASEAN and China is also very broad, covering the area of education, culture, public health, science and technology, labor and local government, and people-to-people exchange, media, youth, and social development. For example, on education, that you may be interested, since 2010, ASEAN and China have made effort to double 100,000 goal of student mobility that envisage the number of exchange students from ASEAN countries to China to reach 100,000 by 2020. So there are a lot of changes, a lot of chances for all of you to go to visit China. In fact, it's very close from here to China. You can even walk to China, but it takes a few days. Better go by boat or go by coach or other way, or by plane. Easiest. Moreover, 10 ASEAN-China education and training centers have already been established in 6 provinces of China. ASEAN and China also designated last year, the year 2014, as ASEAN-China Cultural Exchange Year. Moreover, China has also established the Confucius Institute in all ASEAN countries. In Thailand, there are about 20 Confucius Institute in various universities from the north to the south Thailand, including in these universities. They also established Confucius classroom in many high schools, for example, in Gilada High School, in Wat Rai High School, for example. So relations and exchanges between China and ASEAN has expanded tremendously. Well, talking about the positive side, I would like to talk about if you look at the geo-economics and geo-social dimension, you can see that ASEAN-China relationship has been moving in a positive direction. But for the geopolitical relations, things have to be taken into consideration. Dr. Lee has mentioned about the South China Sea and also the land border area, including the backbone rivers development matters. Let me add a few things to what Dr. Lee has just mentioned, is that the tensions between China and some ASEAN countries start in 1990, especially the clash between mentioned that the Chinese also proposed a bilateral solution, but the Philippines sizing that the asymmetrical power relation, so they prefer a collective, asking ASEAN to be the big intermediaries. Thailand plays quite an important role in this because we know China very well and we saw a good friend of the Philippines and India. We were able to convince both sides to agree upon. And the first ASEAN-China meeting on the South China Sea is in Hangzhou in 1996. And from then on, the relationship is better because it was mitigated by a certain extent by 2002 DOC, Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. While the parties to the declaration declared that they undertook to resolve their territorial and jurisdictional dispute by peaceful means and to exercise self-restraint in the conduct of activity that would complicate or escalate dispute and affect peace and stability. However, the DOC weakness is that it is not legally a binding agreement. And therefore, the present tensions, especially since 2010, between some ASEAN members and China, indicate the failure not far for the regional multilateral diplomacy between ASEAN and China. And therefore, there has been a concern that in order to prevent further conflict and confrontation, we should bring about a binding code of conduct, the COC, in order to mitigate the possibility of the armed conflict or confrontation, either by or as Dr. Lai mentioned. But China seems not to be quite enthusiastic about a COC. When Thailand became the coordinator of the ASEAN-China dialogue relations in 2013, Thailand tried very hard and quite successful in becoming a partner, trying to bring about the discussion and dialogue between ASEAN and China about this. And we were able to engage the Chinese to discuss about the DOC. In fact, in the past 3 years that Thailand has played a role as a coordinator, we were able to get some agreement. They call it commonality. They call it. There is not commonality among ASEAN and China. However, we have to pass on our coordinator to Singapore. And now Singapore is the coordinator on the ASEAN-China. And I am sure that Singapore, with the help of Thailand and also Indonesia, will be able to conclude this COC so that problems will be mitigated. So, in other words, the South China Sea line is the crossroads of some of the most important trends in Asia-Pacific region today. The rising power of China, the U.S. rebalance of pivot toward Asia and ASEAN, increasing desire to shape the regional security environment and take a sharp edge of the growing competition between China, the rising power, and the United States, the hegemonic power. In fact, I think the Chinese leader also realized that South China Sea would be the sore part in the good ASEAN-China relations. And therefore, with the new leadership of Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, the new Chinese leadership, the fifth generation, led by Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, has appeared to reposition China relation with ASEAN. In October 2013, President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang embarked upon a high-profile trip to 5 members of ASEAN. Xi Jinping made a statement to the Indonesian Parliament on the 3rd October 2013 before in Indonesia, and he wants to build a community of common destiny. China, let me repeat, China wants to build a community of common destiny with ASEAN members. What kind of common community? That can be seen from the talk by the President, the Premier of China at the 16th ASEAN-China Summit on October 2013, Li Keqiang made a proposal known as 2+7 cooperation framework. 2+7, then you Chinese like all these code words. 2+7 cooperation framework. They reveal the new leadership policy direction regarding Southeast Asia for the next decade and signal China's attempt to find a new direction for her relationship with ASEAN. The 2+7 cooperation framework consists of a two-point political consensus that the basis for promoting cooperation between China and ASEAN is deeper strategic trust. I think the Chinese realize that there has been trust between China and ASEAN. That's why one of the two consensus they want to have is promoting cooperation through deepening the strategic trust and good neighborliness. The other one was the key to deepening cooperation is to focus on economic development and expanding mutual benefit. The 7-point proposals are the activities that the Chinese propose to cooperate with ASEAN. And this 7-point proposal has some interesting idea for further cooperation, including signing a treaty on good neighborliness, upgrading the ASEAN-China free trade area, setting up an ASEAN infrastructure investment (AIIB), which the Chinese has already set up with ASEAN member as a participant, and also building a 21st Maritime Silk Road. This is also the initiative that Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang has been promoting. Yilu. Yidai is one economic belt, and Yilu is one economic road, and is related to the Silk Road, the ancient Silk Road. If you look at China at the center, on the western part, the economic belt, the new Silk Road economic belt, linking China with the Central Asia, with the Middle East, and also to Europe. And for the eastern part of China, you have this new maritime Silk Road for the 21st century, which will include the coastal part of China and also Southeast Asia into the Indian Ocean. So in other words, the Chinese have been using the past to serve the present and the future. As a result, I think let's take a look. Let me conclude by looking at ASEAN as a strategy toward China in order to keep a good relation. ASEAN members adopt a range of strategies, but in general, I think the trend is to engage with China strategically. In other words, the strategic engagement with China has three distinct characteristics. The first part by engaging in economic dimensions, trading with China and bringing China into regional institutions. ASEAN can reap economic benefits and at the same time create an opportunity to socialize China into the regional norms and behaviors, the ASEAN norms. The second one is by engaging not only China but also other major powers in a balanced way. I call this balanced strategic engagement with China and all the other major powers. Engage them in a balanced way in the same regional organization, ASEAN Regional Forum, for example. ASEAN can encourage dialogue and consultation among them and prevent any one great power from dominating the regions. While not a concern of great power, ASEAN strategy leads to a delicate balance of interests in the regions. Within this arrangement, therefore, ASEAN can seek to manage, maybe to a certain extent, a limited one, the relation between great power by acting as an intermediary. And the third characteristic of this strategic engagement with China and the major powers is that by preventing one great power from dominating regional affairs, ASEAN can maintain its centrality in East Asian regionalism. In order to stay relevant, ASEAN must maintain its centrality in shaping regional norms and institutions so that interstate relations are conducted in a rule-based system rather than in the realm of unconstrained power politics. ASEAN unity mattered a great deal for this purpose and enhanced ASEAN status and interest in shaping regionalism. I am a bit concerned about ASEAN centralities and ASEAN unity because without ASEAN unity, ASEAN centrality will be in question. And I think at the moment you may see that some country has already depended upon China, and that may have some effect on ASEAN unity. So I think it is important that ASEAN members, especially Thailand, Singapore, and Indonesia, should work together in order to maintain this unity and also centrality. In other words, to conclude my talk, ASEAN must try to enhance its capacity and develop a clear vision and roadmap for an enduring rule-based regional security order. It should also enhance the management of existing multilateral processes through improving connectivity and coordination and delineating clearly the primary role and competency of each processes within the regional security architecture for peace and stability in Southeast Asia.
So, is there any question to our distinguished guests? You can ask now.
I am Ken from Burma. I am instructor from School of Social Innovation. In my opinion, and by learning, I think we ASEAN have one impossible dream, which is ASEAN unity. And also by our topic, ASEAN and China, I do not think China really treats us as one. According to their bilateral policy, they always treat just as 10. So my question is, I have several questions. Does China has a desire to become hegemonic power on ASEAN? For example, in terms of ethnic issues, China never treat a country as one. They treat the government in one way and they treat another opposition group in another way. And in ASEAN itself, the people and the government are not one too. If we study about Thailand, Burma, it's the same. The government is another different group and we are in another standard. So my question is, for China, do they have a desire to be hegemonic power? Because they keep helping opposition group. For example, in Burma, they are helping Luang and Kukan when they have no good relationship with the junta or the regime. But now, starting from next year, we are going to have people government, not just a junta. So my question is, what is the main purpose in terms of ASEAN? Do they want to become a hegemonic power? Number two, to Ajahn, especially to Ajahn Chullacheeb, as the coordinator of ASEAN-China dialogue relation from 2013 to 2015, Thailand is a coordinator. Do you think Thailand can be an honest broker, not agent, but an honest broker between ASEAN and China? And number three, we have mentioned a lot about One Belt, One Road China policy, but I think the second Marine Council road just passed by Bandar Aceh or Southeast Asia part of Thailand, not to another 8 nations. So, as a scholar, how about your skeptical opinion, not supporting opinion, but how about your skeptical opinion whether this kind of thing can help the development of ASEAN? Thank you.
respond to the remarks made by Professor Chullacheeb too. I think it's very nice of Professor Chullacheeb to add in more points, especially those on social cultural aspect, because my presentation is basically on the political, security, and economic aspects. But I think it's important for us to understand there are also other interactions too, right, between China and ASEAN. And after all, bear in mind that there is always hard power and soft power. And China is trying to promote its soft power too, not just hard power. It's not always guns and bullets. And that's why all these cultural and educational exchanges and tourism and whatnot, I think will be very important factors in promoting understanding between China and ASEAN. Of course, the Confucius Institute and other things I think will come in, are handy as examples of the so-called soft power exercised by China. That's one thing. A second point that I want to add is that the strategies adopted by ASEAN, right? I think Professor Chullacheeb mentioned quite a few, engaging China in a balanced way, and of course the importance of the centrality of ASEAN will be critical. But let me just add by saying that for ASEAN, yes, we would like to engage China. But we also want to engage other major powers. It's not the classical balance of power. I don't know if you're familiar with theories in international relations. It's not a classical balance of power. It is trying to actually dilute the influence of any major power wanting to play a dominant role or hegemonic role. Let's now respond to the question raised by Ken. In the sense that we are trying to invite them to come, and we are realistic to understand that you cannot ask the major powers to leave us alone. No way. All right? What do? If you're from Thailand or you're from Singapore. So our strategy is that the more the merrier. Come, why not? Come to South Asia. But we make sure that there's some balance among them. And I want to suggest one term that you can use to analyze this sort of situation. It's what we call a hedging strategy. I don't know if you play with shares and stocks. When you buy shares and stocks, most of you would like to hedge your bets. You know how to hedge your bets? You don't want to, say, buy just one share and one share alone. You try to diversify your investments into a number of shares to lessen your risk. And you can apply the same strategy when you look at foreign policy and security policy. You don't want to bank on just China or bank on the United States alone. You want to spread your linkages, you want to spread your risk. And in that way, okay, the Americans will come, okay, we engage you, you can join ARF as a member. Okay, China, we want you too, we want to engage you, you can be a member of ARF. So, in that way, nobody, no one power can actually dominate, including the Americans. Right? And so, you ask whether China can be a hegemonic power. I really have no doubts. Because the Americans are here. Alright? How can China dominate everything? But of course, it will try to be more influential in mapping out certain policies. Say, for example, in terms of economics, President Obama is trying to rebalance so-called Asia-Pacific strategy. Alright? It's coming back. He would like to call himself a Pacific president, so to speak. Right? But then, having said that, China is fully aware of the fact that, the Americans are concerned with the rise of China. The Americans have been telling the Chinese that they're concerned about the freedom of navigation in South China Sea. The Americans are now leading the TPP aware of that Trans-Pacific Partnership under the leadership of the United States. The Chinese are now trying to do something likewise. Just now, Mr. Chullacheeb talked about the One Belt, One Road, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and so on and so forth. And it's also proposing some regional cooperation framework, like the RCEP. I don't know if you've heard about it, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is something for ASEAN, China, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand, but without the United States. Oh, okay. Because of the shortage of time, so the point I want to stress is that there is a balancing game, no doubt. But this is what we call a hedging strategy, okay, adopted by the China, by ASEAN. And of course, ASEAN, if ever it wants to maintain its neutrality, I would suggest that it must be able to put its own house in order. We have too many differences among ourselves. We're pretty good in dealing with the outside world, but you talk to one another, and then you realize that, oh, we do have some problems. All right? Maintaining unity, no doubt, is important. And that's why, let's go back to all these concepts about the ASEAN community, the ASEAN political security community, the ASEAN community, the ASEAN social cultural community, all promoted by ASEAN. Hopefully, that there is a community of nations in South Asia promoting the interests of this part of the world. Thank you very much.
I have to leave in a minute, therefore I have to give a brief answer. But you will stay with that, you can ask more for the next half an hour or an hour. As for the two questions, the first one I agree with Dr. Lilaito that with the American presence, I think it will be very difficult for China to be hegemonic, but definitely China wants to be influential in this part of the world. But I think it's up to ASEAN whether we will let any country having influence in this part of the world or not. As for your second question about Thailand, has been an honest broker or not, in my opinion, I think we did. Because in the past 3 years, if we did not play our honest broker, we would not be able to get the Chinese and ASEAN together for a dialogue for 3 years. And be able to get commonalities with the common elements to be included in the COC, which will be up to Singapore to try to speed it up in the future. Without that, because before Thailand become the coordinator, China did not pay attention at all on having to engage in the COC. They thought that it is no use, but with Thailand effort and Thailand insistence, China was able to agree and spend a good through 3 years to gain these commonalities. And if you have any other question, and Dr. Lilaito will be pleased to answer instead of me. Thank you very much.
Okay, is there any question?
Good afternoon, Professor Dr. Lee. I'm Ajahn Suvita from School of Law. I want to know about Singapore. Singapore is one of the countries that sharply feels the sense of competition between the US and China, right? I want to know about how Singapore can balance the relationship between the two big powers. Yes, that's the first question. And the last question for me depend on the NLD, the National League for Democracy of Aung San Suu Kyi won the general election in Myanmar in the last 2 weeks maybe. Do you think how does it affect to the China and Myanmar relationship? Because the relationship between China and the military government are very strong. Thank you very much.
first question is about how Singapore balances the influence of the major powers. Well, this is actually a very important question for us, in the sense that over the years, Singapore has been trying to be friendly towards everybody. We like to think that we do not have enemies. Even at the time of the Cold War, just in case you do not know, yes, we were fighting against the communists, but at the same time, we were also trading with the Soviet Union and also China. You just look at the statistics. So in that way, it is trying to be friendly towards everybody, all right? But for some reasons, and especially when it's threatening the security of Singapore, we don't really care if you're from the Soviet Union or from the United States. You look at the record, even for the United States, which we have been working very, very closely. There were times that we strained our relationship with Washington because of their interference into the domestic politics of Singapore. We asked one of the embassy staff to leave Singapore. All right? We also punished one of the Americans in Singapore for violating one of the laws in Singapore, because that young boy from the United States, were actually committing all sort of crimes in Singapore. And according to our law, he has to be punished by caning. That's the British way. We inherited that from the British. And so there was a campaign against Singapore in the United States, because Singapore was going to cane that American boy because of what he did. He was having all sort of graffitis on the wall. He was breaking down all the signposts in the Singapore roads and so on and so forth. So that was not acceptable, and it has to be punished. All right? So even President Clinton at that point tried to ask the Singapore government not to cane him, because to the Americans that's inhumane. But that is a law applicable to everybody, whether it's Americans or Singaporeans or Indonesians, makes no difference. So in the end, in order to give some face, so to speak, to the Americans, the number of strokes of the cane was reduced, I think by 2. It was supposed to be 5 canes, and then reduced to 3 canes. We just press ahead and cane the ball. And so what I'm trying to say is that yes, we would like to work with the major powers, whether it's China, US, Japan, India, and even to some extent Russia. And all of them are most welcome. And the strategy that we adopt is that you don't bar anybody from coming in. It's impossible. Because as I said, you cannot ask that the major powers to leave. And so you have to be realistic. But then in inviting to come, you make sure that nobody is telling you what to do. Nobody is interfering into your domestic politics. That's not acceptable. Alright? So once they seem to be interfering into domestic politics, in this case, of course, the United States, we also have problems with them. Alright? And so in that way, it is a balancing game that we are adopting. As I've said, you can use the term hedging. Hedging. That is, we try to spread out our links with different parties, the Americans, the Chinese, the Japanese, and Indonesians, and so on and so forth. We have we like to think, these are all friends, all right? And so in that way, I think we can always dilute the dominance of any power, including the Americans, right? And in that way, we manage to survive as a small city-state. Not only surviving, we also manage to get a lot of benefits from different parties, including China and the United States, right? But I think in the final analysis, there is a realistic recognition in China that the world, especially in terms of security, will be dominated by the Americans and the Chinese. These are the two that will decide or play a critical role in shaping our future, especially the security architecture of the Asian region. Alright? So we try to play the role of a middleman. Alright? We want to tell the Chinese what the Americans are thinking about, what the Americans are doing. When we go to Washington, the Americans will ask us, what do you think of the Chinese? What they took blah, blah, blah. Right? And so we are considered as a good channel to communicate with the other side. Alright? And so in that way, we hope that China and the United States can work together, will have dialogues, and if they have problems, they can talk it over. I think the worst case scenario is that if the two, that is the United States, is fighting against China, we are asked to take side. Which side are you on? That will be, I think, very difficult for us, because we don't want to take any side. So we just hope that the two will not have serious conflicts. We hope the two will work together. And that, if they have problems, talk about it and try to resolve them. Alright? So in that way, that is how we're handling the influence of the major powers. We're realistic, but at the same time, we're fully aware that it is important for us to retain our territorial integrity and our sovereignty. Make sure that they don't really interfere into our domestic politics. Okay? So that's the question on Singapore. The second question is about, I think, Myanmar, am I correct? And how the situation in Myanmar will affect China's relations with Myanmar. I don't have a crystal ball, all right? But I would believe that from the Chinese perspective, it is important for them to work together with Myanmar, all right? Over the years, I think the Chinese have been most supportive. Even the military government, I think have been liaising with China very, very closely, all right? And China would like to invest more in Myanmar if possible. In fact, not so long ago, they would like to construct a dam. Unfortunately, the dam was dropped because of the concern and the suspicion that the Chinese are really exploiting the resources in Myanmar. All right? On top of that, just now I mentioned about the problems of the minority groups supported by the Chinese. So these could be problems. But I don't think they are very difficult to resolve. Right? If the Chinese can sit down and talk to the government, whether it's a new government under organization or the present government, I think something can be worked out. Because after all, the Chinese are also pragmatic to understand that it is important to give the people in Myanmar that they are out there to be helpful. And that what they propose are actually mutually beneficial. Right? So in that way, I think whether it's Aung San Suu Kyi or some other governments, they will talk to China and see if they can get a good deal out of Chinese. And I think in many ways, the Chinese is now in a better position to be more helpful. All right? In fact, if you look at, say, for example, the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement that I mentioned in my lecture just now, it's actually meant to promote more trade and more investment to help, particularly the states in continental Southeast Asia, because they're having trade deficits with China. In other words, China was actually exporting too many things to these places, so much so that they've got a deficit. And so this agreement, that is the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement, was meant to balance the trade a little bit by getting more products from the Southeast Asian region. Right? And so China actually has made a deliberate political move to work closely with Southeast Asia. All right? Chinese would also like to impress on you that it is easier for Asians to work together because the Chinese always have problems with Americans. Yeah? But you know, they are more comfortable working with Asians. They always say that let's do it in our Asian way. Let's do it what they call the Oriental way. Right? So I would suggest that we can afford to be cautiously optimistic that China will try to be more helpful, especially when it's trying to emphasize the importance of neighboring regions. Bear in mind that one of the major emphasis of Chinese foreign policy in recent years is to promote friendly ties with neighboring regions. 睦邻外交, meaning that to be friendly with neighboring regions. And that will include South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you for question and answer.
We have now reached to the end of our party lecture. So we would like to thank you, our distinguished scholar, for an insightful and intellectual stimulating lecture.
We great appreciation to you, our audience, for your active participation. We are sure the lecture today is greatly beneficial for all.